The morning sun painted the palace gardens in golden hues as 8-year-old Prince Alexander walked through the carefully manicured pathways. His small shoes clicked softly against the marble stones, while his tutor, Mr. Harrison, followed a few steps behind, carrying books for their outdoor lesson. The palace grounds stretched endlessly before them, filled with fountains, rose bushes, and ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of royal children playing beneath their branches. Alexander was not like other princes. While his older brother Charles preferred sword fighting and hunting, Alexander spent his time reading books about faraway lands and talking to the palace servants about their lives. His mother, Queen Isabella, often worried that her youngest son was too gentle for the harsh realities of royal life. His father, King William, hoped the boy would grow stronger with age, but secretly admired his son's kind heart. On this particular morning, Alexander had convinced Mr. Harrison to conduct their history lesson in the gardens instead of the stuffy library. The old tutor, who had taught 3 generations of royal children, found it impossible to refuse the prince's earnest requests. They settled on a bench near the fountain, where the sound of flowing water created a peaceful atmosphere for learning. As Mr. Harrison opened the thick history book, Alexander's attention wandered to the palace gates visible in the distance. He could see the royal guards standing at attention, their red uniforms bright against the iron bars of the entrance. These men dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, standing for hours in all kinds of weather, never complaining, never leaving their posts. "Prince Alexander, are you listening?" Mr. Harrison's gentle voice brought the boy's attention back to the lesson. "Yes, sir. You were telling me about the great kings of the past," Alexander replied, though his eyes kept drifting toward the guards. Mr. Harrison smiled knowingly. He had noticed the prince's fascination with the palace staff and guards. Unlike other royal children who barely acknowledged the servants, Alexander always greeted them by name and asked about their families. The old tutor found this quality both admirable and concerning, knowing that a future king needed to maintain certain boundaries. The great kings, Mr. Harrison continued, were not just brave in battle. They were also wise in their treatment of their subjects. King Edward the Just, for example, was known for listening to the concerns of common people. Alexander perked up at this. He talked to common people? Even when he was busy with royal duties? Indeed. He believed that a good king must understand the lives of all his people, not just the nobles in his court. Mr. Harrison watched as the prince absorbed this information, knowing it would resonate with the boy's natural inclinations. The lesson continued for another hour, covering the reigns of various monarchs and their different approaches to leadership. Alexander listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about how these kings balanced their royal responsibilities with their human compassion. Mr. Harrison was impressed by the depth of the boy's questions, which showed a maturity beyond his 8 years. As they prepared to return to the palace for lunch, Alexander noticed something unusual near the main gate. One of the guards, a tall man named Captain Morrison, whom Alexander had spoken to many times, seemed to be swaying slightly. The prince stopped walking and squinted to get a better look. "Mr. Harrison, does Captain Morrison look all right to you?" Alexander asked, pointing toward the gate. The tutor followed the prince's gaze and frowned. Even from this distance, something did appear to be wrong. The guard's usual straight posture seemed compromised, and he appeared to be gripping his spear more tightly than usual. "Perhaps we should return to the palace, Your Highness. It's nearly time for lunch," Mr. Harrison suggested, not wanting to involve the young prince in what might be a security matter. But Alexander's concern for Captain Morrison grew stronger as they walked. He had always admired the dedication of the palace guards, especially Captain Morrison, who had served the royal family for 15 years. The captain had once told Alexander stories about his own son, who was close to the prince's age, and Alexander had developed a genuine fondness for the man. "I think something is really wrong with Captain Morrison," Alexander insisted, his young voice filled with worry. Mr. Harrison sighed, knowing that once Prince Alexander set his mind on something, especially something involving the welfare of others, it was nearly impossible to dissuade him. This trait, while admirable, often led to complications in the highly structured world of palace life. As they approached the palace entrance, Alexander's suspicions were confirmed. Captain Morrison was clearly struggling, though he continued to maintain his post with admirable determination. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his breathing appeared labored. The other guards nearby seemed unaware of their colleagues' distress, focused as they were on their own duties. Alexander felt his heart racing with concern. He had been taught that the guards were there to protect him, but now one of them needed protection. The lessons about great kings echoed in his mind, particularly Mr. Harrison's words about King Edward the Just and his care for all his subjects. The prince's mind raced with possibilities. Should he tell his father? Should he alert the head of palace security? But both of those options would take time, and Captain Morrison looked like he needed help immediately. Alexander had never faced a situation like this before, where his royal status might actually be useful in helping someone else. Standing at the crossroads between childhood innocence and the first stirrings of leadership responsibility, Prince Alexander made a decision that would surprise everyone around him and teach him a valuable lesson about the true meaning of royal authority. The boy who preferred books to swords was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon a prince possesses is his compassion combined with his position. As they drew closer to the struggling guard, Alexander took a deep breath and prepared to take action, unaware that this moment would become a defining experience in his journey toward understanding what it truly meant to be royal. Prince Alexander quickened his pace as they approached the main gate, his concern for Captain Morrison overriding any thoughts of royal protocol. Mr. Harrison hurried to keep up with his determined young charge, clutching the history books tightly to his chest. The tutor's face showed a mixture of pride and anxiety as he watched the prince's compassionate nature override his usual obedience to palace rules. When they reached the gate, Alexander could see Captain Morrison's condition had worsened. The guard's face had grown pale and small tremors ran through his hands as he gripped his ceremonial spear. Yet the dedicated soldier continued to stand at attention, his sense of duty preventing him from abandoning his post, despite his obvious distress. "Captain Morrison," Alexander called out softly as he approached. The guard turned his head slightly, surprised to see the young prince so close to the gate during the morning hours. Despite his discomfort, Captain Morrison attempted to straighten his posture and offer a proper salute. "Your Highness," Morrison managed to say, though his voice was strained. "Good morning, Prince Alexander. Captain Morrison, you don't look well."
"Are you feeling sick?"
Alexander asked directly, his young voice filled with genuine concern. The guard hesitated, torn between his duty to maintain his post and his respect for the prince's question. Palace protocol dictated that guards should not burden the royal family with personal problems, especially health issues that might be seen as weakness or failure of duty. "I am fine, Your Highness. Just a bit tired from the night shift," Morrison replied, though anyone could see this was far from the truth. Mr. Harrison stepped closer, his experienced eyes taking in the guard's condition. As someone who had spent decades in the palace, he recognized the signs of serious illness. The tutor's concern grew as he noticed the slight blue tinge around Morrison's lips and the way the man seemed to be struggling for breath. "Captain Morrison," Mr. Harrison said gently, "perhaps you should sit down for a moment." "I cannot leave my post, sir," Morrison replied firmly, though his voice wavered with the effort of speaking. Alexander looked between the guard and his tutor, his mind working quickly to process the situation. He remembered the stories Mr. Harrison had just told him about great kings who cared for their subjects. He also remembered something his mother had taught him about the responsibilities that came with royal privilege. "Captain Morrison," Alexander said, his young voice taking on a tone of authority that surprised everyone present. "As your prince, I order you to sit down immediately." The words hung in the air for a moment. Morrison looked stunned. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened in surprise, and even the other guards within earshot turned their heads at the unusual sound of the 8-year-old prince giving orders. Morrison's training and loyalty to the crown battled with his physical distress. The direct order from a member of the royal family, even such a young one, carried significant weight in the rigid hierarchy of palace life. After a moment's hesitation, the guard slowly lowered himself onto a nearby stone bench, his relief evident despite his embarrassment at abandoning his post. "Your Highness, I should not," Morrison began to protest. "You should listen to your prince," Alexander interrupted with surprising firmness. "Mr. Harrison, please go find Dr. Matthews immediately. Tell him it's urgent." The old tutor looked at his young charge with newfound respect, In that moment, he saw a glimpse of the leader Alexander might one day become. Without hesitation, Mr. Harrison hurried toward the palace to fetch the royal physician. Alexander sat down beside Captain Morrison on the bench, completely ignoring the fact that such informal behavior was unprecedented for a member of the royal family. The other guards watched in amazement as their 8-year-old prince showed more leadership in this moment than many adults had displayed in similar situations. "Captain Morrison, tell me what's wrong," Alexander said gently, his commanding tone softening into one of genuine care. Morrison looked at the young prince with tears in his eyes. The combination of physical distress and emotional overwhelm at the boy's kindness was almost too much to bear. For 15 years he had served the royal family with dedication, but never had he experienced such direct, personal concern from any member of the royal household. "I've been having chest pains since yesterday evening, Your Highness," Morrison admitted quietly, "but I didn't want to abandon my duties. My family depends on this position, and I was afraid that if I showed weakness—" "Your family needs you healthy more than they need you to work when you're sick," Alexander said with wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "Besides, what good is a guard who might collapse at any moment?" The simple logic of the prince's words struck Morrison deeply. He had been so focused on his duty that he had failed to consider how his stubbornness might actually compromise his ability to protect the royal family. The irony was not lost on him that an 8-year-old prince had shown better judgment than he had. Other guards began to gather around, curious about the unusual scene of their youngest prince sitting casually beside one of their colleagues. Some looked concerned about the breach of protocol, while others seemed moved by the display of compassion from someone so young. Alexander noticed the gathering crowd and realized that his actions were drawing attention. For a moment he wondered if he had done something wrong. Palace life was full of rules about proper behavior, and he was quite certain that ordering guards around and sitting on benches with them was not covered in any etiquette lessons he had received. But as he looked at Captain Morrison's grateful face and saw the relief in the man's posture now that he was finally sitting down, Alexander felt confident that he had made the right choice. Sometimes he realized being royal meant more than following rules. Sometimes it meant using his position to help others, even when it might seem unusual or improper to other people. The sound of hurried footsteps announced the arrival of Dr. Matthews, who appeared slightly out of breath from his rush to respond to Mr. Harrison's urgent summons. The elderly physician's surprise was evident when he saw the young prince sitting beside the ailing guard, but his professional instincts quickly took over. "Let me examine you, Captain Morrison," Dr. Matthews said, opening his medical bag. Dr. Matthews quickly knelt beside Captain Morrison, his experienced hands checking the guard's pulse and examining his color. The physician's frown deepened as he took in Morrison's symptoms, and Alexander watched anxiously as the doctor worked with quiet efficiency. "Captain Morrison, how long have you been experiencing these chest pains?" Dr. Matthews asked while listening to the guard's heart with his stethoscope. "Since yesterday evening, sir, but I thought it was just indigestion from dinner," Morrison replied, his breathing still labored. Dr. Matthews exchanged a concerned glance with Mr. Harrison, who had returned and now stood nearby. The physician's years of experience told him this was potentially serious, and he was grateful that someone had intervened before Morrison collapsed completely. "Prince Alexander," Dr. Matthews said, turning to the young boy with respect, "your quick thinking may have prevented a very serious situation. Captain Morrison needs immediate medical attention." Alexander felt a mixture of pride and worry at the doctor's words. He was glad he had helped, but the confirmation that Morrison was truly ill made his stomach flutter with concern for the kind guard who had always treated him with such warmth and respect. "Will Captain Morrison be all right?" Alexander asked, his young voice filled with genuine worry. "With proper treatment and rest, yes," Dr. Matthews assured him. "But he needs to come to the medical wing immediately. This could be his heart, and we cannot take any chances." At the mention of heart problems, Morrison's face went pale with fear. He thought of his wife Sarah and his young son Tommy, who was just a year younger than Prince Alexander. The financial burden of medical treatment and potential loss of work weighed heavily on his mind. Alexander noticed the fear in Morrison's eyes and felt compelled to offer reassurance. The prince had learned from observing his parents that leadership sometimes meant providing comfort and security to those who served under you. "Captain Morrison, don't worry about anything except getting better," Alexander said with surprising authority. "Your family will be taken care of, and your position will be waiting for you when you're well." Mr. Harrison looked at his young charge with amazement. The 8-year-old prince was making promises about employment and family care that typically would require approval from much higher authorities. Yet there was something so natural and confident in Alexander's manner that it seemed entirely appropriate. Dr. Matthews nodded approvingly at the prince's words. "His Highness is absolutely right, Captain Morrison. Your only concern should be recovery." As Dr. Matthews helped Morrison to his feet to escort him to the medical wing, Alexander stood as well. The prince's mind was already working on practical matters, thinking about how to ensure his promises to Morrison could be kept. "Mr. Harrison," Alexander said quietly to his tutor, "I need to speak with my father immediately about Captain Morrison's family." The old tutor smiled at his young charge's sense of responsibility. "Of course, Your Highness. I believe your father will be very interested to hear about what happened here today." As they watched Dr. Matthews carefully guide Morrison toward the palace medical wing, other guards began to disperse back to their posts. However, Alexander could see them talking among themselves, and he sensed that word of what had happened would spread quickly throughout the palace staff. Sergeant Williams, the senior guard on duty, approached Prince Alexander with obvious respect and gratitude. "Your Highness, on behalf of all the guards, I want to thank you for what you did for Captain Morrison. He's been struggling for days but wouldn't admit it. Why didn't any of you help him?" Alexander asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity about how the palace hierarchy worked. Sergeant Williams looked uncomfortable as he tried to explain. "Well, Your Highness, we're taught not to show weakness or complain about personal problems. Morrison outranks most of us, and we assumed he would ask for help if he needed it." Alexander considered this explanation, and it troubled him. The idea that people might suffer in silence because of rules or pride seemed very wrong to the young prince. He made a mental note to discuss this with his father as well. "From now on," Alexander said with the same authority he had used to order Morrison to sit down, "if any of you notice that someone is sick or in trouble, you should help them immediately." "That's an order from your prince." The guards looked at each other uncertainly. Orders from an 8-year-old, even a royal 8-year-old, were somewhat unusual in the strict military hierarchy of palace security. But there was something compelling about Alexander's natural authority and obvious concern for their welfare. "Yes, Your Highness," Sergeant Williams replied formally, though his tone conveyed genuine appreciation for the prince's concern. As Alexander and Mr. Harrison walked back toward the palace, the prince felt a strange mixture of emotions. He was proud that he had helped Captain Morrison, but he was also troubled by what he had learned about the isolation that palace rules could create. The guards protected his family every day, but who protected them? "Mr. Harrison," Alexander said as they climbed the marble steps to the palace entrance, "do you think I did the right thing by giving orders to the guards?" The old tutor considered his answer carefully. "Your Highness, leadership often requires making difficult decisions without consulting others first. Today you saw someone in need and you used your authority to help them. I believe that's exactly what a good king should do. But I'm not a king yet. I'm just a prince, and not even the oldest prince," Alexander said with the uncertainty of childhood creeping into his voice. "Age doesn't determine when someone is ready to lead, Your Highness. Character does. And today you showed the character of a true leader." As they entered the palace, Alexander's mind was already racing ahead to his conversation with his father. He wanted to ensure that Captain Morrison's family would indeed be cared for during his recovery, and he wanted to discuss the problems he had observed in the palace hierarchy that prevented people from helping each other. The young prince was beginning to understand that his royal position came with both privileges and responsibilities. The privilege of authority meant nothing if it wasn't used to help others, especially those who dedicated their lives to serving his family. Palace servants who passed them in the corridors seemed to look at Alexander with new respect. Word of the morning's events was already spreading through the complex network of palace staff communication, and the young prince's reputation for kindness was being enhanced by stories of his decisive action. Alexander barely noticed the attention, focused as he was on planning his approach to his father and ensuring that his promises to Captain Morrison could be fulfilled. King William was reviewing state documents in his private study when a gentle knock interrupted his concentration. He looked up to see his youngest son standing in the doorway with Mr. Harrison beside him. both wearing expressions of unusual seriousness for a morning that should have been spent on simple lessons. "Father, may I speak with you about something important?" Alexander asked, his small hands clasped behind his back in the formal manner he had been taught for official conversations. King William set down his papers immediately. His 8-year-old son rarely requested formal audiences, preferring to share his thoughts during their casual evening walks or family dinners. The serious tone in Alexander's voice suggested something significant had occurred. "Of course, my son. Come in and tell me what's troubling you," the king said, gesturing for Alexander to take a seat in the comfortable chair across from his desk. Mr. Harrison bowed respectfully to the king. "Your Majesty, Prince Alexander handled a rather extraordinary situation this morning that I believe you should hear about directly from him." Alexander took a deep breath and began to recount the morning's events, starting with his observation of Captain Morrison's distress and ending with his orders to the guards and promises about Morrison's family care. King William listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail of his son's story. "So you ordered Captain Morrison to sit down and commanded the guards to help each other in the future?" King William asked when Alexander finished, his tone neutral but his eyes showing interest. "Yes, father. I know I'm supposed to ask permission before giving orders, but Captain Morrison looked like he might fall down, and nobody else was helping him," Alexander explained, worried that he might have overstepped his authority. King William was quiet for a long moment, processing not just what his son had done, but the reasoning behind it. The boy had shown initiative, compassion, and natural leadership instincts that impressed the experienced monarch. However, the situation also raised questions about protocol and the chain of command within the palace. "Tell me, Alexander, why do you think the other guards didn't help Captain Morrison?" King William asked. Sergeant Williams said they're taught not to show weakness or complain about personal problems, and since Captain Morrison outranked them, they thought he would ask for help if he needed it, Alexander replied, repeating the explanation he had received. King William nodded slowly. He was well aware of the rigid hierarchy that governed palace life, and he recognized that while such structure maintained order and discipline, it could sometimes prevent common sense and human compassion from prevailing. "And what do you think about that explanation?" The king continued, genuinely curious about his son's perspective. Alexander shifted in his chair, thinking carefully about his words. "I think it's silly, father. If someone is sick or hurt, helping them should be more important than following rules about rank or not wanting to seem weak." The simplicity and wisdom of his son's observation struck King William deeply. Sometimes children could see clearly through complications that adults created unnecessarily. The king realized that his youngest son had identified a real problem in the palace culture that needed addressing. "You made promises to Captain Morrison about his family and his position," King William said. "Those are significant commitments that affect palace policy and resources. Do you understand the weight of such promises?" Alexander's face grew serious as he considered his father's question. "I think so, father. Captain Morrison was scared about his family having enough money if he couldn't work. I told him not to worry because it seemed like the right thing to say. But I know I should have asked you first." The impulse to reassure him was correct, King William said gently.
However, you're right that such promises typically require consultation.
"In this case, though, I'm prepared to honor your commitments to Captain Morrison because they align with how we should treat loyal servants who fall ill in our service." Relief flooded Alexander's face, followed quickly by gratitude toward his father for supporting his decisions. The young prince was learning that leadership sometimes meant taking risks and accepting responsibility for the consequences of those risks. "Now," King William continued, "let's discuss the broader implications of what happened today. You identified a problem with how our guards handle situations involving illness or injury among their ranks. You've also demonstrated that age doesn't prevent someone from exercising moral authority when circumstances require it." Mr. Harrison, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward slightly. "Your Majesty, if I may, Prince Alexander's actions this morning showed remarkable instincts for leadership. He saw a problem, took responsibility for solving it, and showed genuine concern for the welfare of those who serve our family." King William smiled at his son's tutor. "I agree completely. Alexander, I want you to understand something important about what happened today. True leadership isn't about having the biggest title or the most power. It's about using whatever authority you have to help others and solve problems. But what if I had been wrong about Captain Morrison? What if he really was just tired and I embarrassed him by making him sit down? Alexander asked, voicing the doubts that had been nagging at him. Then you would have learned from the experience and adjusted your approach next time, King William replied. But the risk of embarrassing someone is much smaller than the risk of letting them collapse from a heart condition. You chose the safer path, which showed good judgment. King William stood up from his desk and walked around to sit in the chair beside his son, making their conversation more intimate and less formal. Alexander, I want to make some changes based on what you've observed today. I'm going to establish new protocols that encourage guards and staff to look out for each other's welfare without fear of showing weakness. Alexander's eyes widened with excitement. Really? You'll change the rules? Good rules should protect people and help them do their jobs better. Rules that prevent people from helping each other when they're sick or in trouble are not good rules, King William explained. The king paused, considering how to frame his next thoughts for his young son. I'm also going to create a new position in the palace, a welfare officer whose job is to ensure that all our staff feel comfortable, reporting health problems or personal difficulties that might affect their work. That's a wonderful idea, Father, Alexander exclaimed, then immediately looked thoughtful. But who would want such a difficult job? King William chuckled at his son's question. Someone who cares about people the way you do, Alexander. Someone who understands that taking care of others is one of the most important responsibilities we have. As their conversation continued, both father and son began to realize that the morning's events had taught them valuable lessons about leadership, compassion, and the importance of questioning established systems when they don't serve people well. Later that afternoon, King William called an emergency meeting with his senior staff, including the head of palace security, the chief administrator, and several department heads. Word of Prince Alexander's intervention had spread throughout the palace, and the king wanted to address the situation before misconceptions or rumors could take root. Gentlemen, King William began as the men gathered in the conference room, I've called this meeting to discuss the events of this morning involving Prince Alexander and Captain Morrison, and to announce some important policy changes. General Patterson, the head of palace security, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been dreading this conversation, worried that the prince's actions might be seen as undermining military discipline and the chain of command that kept the palace safe and orderly. Your Majesty, General Patterson began carefully, while we all appreciate Prince Alexander's concern for Captain Morrison's welfare, I'm concerned about the precedent of having royal family members give direct orders to guards without going through proper channels. King William nodded, understanding the general's concerns. Your point about proper channels is well taken, General Patterson. However, I want you all to understand that my son identified a critical gap in our current system that could have had serious consequences. The king went on to explain his conversation with Alexander and the insights the young prince had shared about the barriers that prevented guards from helping each other during medical emergencies. As he spoke, several of the administrators began to nod in recognition of problems they had observed but never fully addressed. Captain Morrison had been suffering chest pains for over 24 hours. King William continued. He was on duty despite a potentially life-threatening condition because he feared showing weakness or abandoning his post. This suggests our current protocols need immediate revision. Mr. Clark, the chief administrator, leaned forward with interest. Your Majesty, we have noticed an increase in guards reporting sick only after their conditions become severe enough to require extended leave. Perhaps they would benefit from earlier intervention. Exactly, King William replied, which is why I'm implementing several changes effective immediately. First, we're establishing a new position of Staff Welfare Officer, whose primary responsibility will be monitoring the health and well-being of all palace employees. General Patterson looked thoughtful as he considered the implications. That could actually improve our security effectiveness, Your Majesty. Guards who feel comfortable addressing health issues early would be more reliable than those who struggle in silence until they collapse. Furthermore, King William continued, I'm authorizing any palace employee to temporarily relieve a colleague from duty if they observe signs of serious illness or distress. This authority supersedes normal rank considerations when health and safety are at stake. The room fell silent as the administrators processed this significant change in palace hierarchy. It was unusual for a monarch to flatten traditional command structures, but the logic behind the decision was compelling. Your Majesty, asked Mr. Williams, the personnel director, how should we handle situations where employees might abuse this new authority to avoid work or settle personal disputes? King William smiled at the practical question. The new welfare officer will investigate all such incidents and recommend appropriate action. False claims will be disciplined severely, but legitimate health concerns will be addressed immediately and with full support. As the meeting continued, the administrators worked through the practical details of implementing these changes. It became clear that Prince Alexander's simple act of caring for a sick guard was going to transform how the entire palace operated. Meanwhile, in the palace medical wing, Dr. Matthews was completing his examination of Captain Morrison. The news was both concerning and encouraging. Morrison had indeed suffered a mild heart episode, but early intervention had prevented it from becoming life-threatening. Captain Morrison, Dr. Matthews explained, you're going to need several weeks of rest and medication to fully recover. The chest pains you experienced were your heart's way of warning you that something was wrong. Morrison nodded gratefully, though worry still clouded his features. Doctor, what about my duties? My family depends on my salary, and I can't afford to lose this position. You heard Prince Alexander's promise this morning, Dr. Matthews replied with a smile. I just received word from His Majesty that your salary will continue during your recovery, and your position will be held for you. The royal family takes care of those who serve them loyally. Tears welled up in Morrison's eyes as the full impact of the morning's events settled in. A young prince's compassion had not only potentially saved his life, but had also protected his family's financial security during his recovery. Dr. Matthews continued his explanation of Morrison's treatment plan, but the guard's mind kept returning to the image of 8-year-old Prince Alexander sitting beside him on the bench, showing more leadership and concern than many adults had displayed in similar situations. That evening, as news of the policy changes spread throughout the palace, staff members gathered in small groups to discuss what had happened. Many expressed amazement that a child's simple act of kindness had resulted in such significant reforms to their working conditions. Sarah Morrison, Captain Morrison's wife, arrived at the palace that evening to visit her husband. She had been terrified when she received word of his illness, but Dr. Matthews' explanation of Prince Alexander's intervention and King William's support had transformed her fear into overwhelming gratitude. I need to thank the young prince, Sarah told her husband as they sat together in the medical wing. Morrison squeezed his wife's hand gently. Prince Alexander didn't help me for thanks, Sarah. He helped because he saw someone in trouble and knew it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of king he'll be someday. As evening fell over the palace, Prince Alexander sat in his room working on a letter to Captain Morrison's son, Tommy. He wanted the boy to know that his father was a hero who had dedicated his life to protecting others, and that the whole royal family was honored by his service. The 8-year-old prince was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't just about giving orders or living in luxury. Real leadership meant using whatever power you had to make life better for others, especially those who couldn't help themselves. Outside his window, Alexander could see the evening shift of guards taking their positions. Thanks to the day's events, they now worked under new rules that prioritized their welfare and encouraged them to care for each other. The young prince felt proud knowing that his actions had helped create a safer, more compassionate environment for everyone who served his family. 3 weeks later, Prince Alexander was delighted to see Captain Morrison returning to the palace for his first day back on light duty. The guard looked healthier and more energetic than he had in months thanks to proper medical treatment and the rest his recovery had required. Captain Morrison, Alexander called out as he spotted the guard during his morning walk through the gardens. You look much better. Morrison smiled broadly at the young prince who had changed his life so dramatically. Thank you, Your Highness. Dr. Matthews says my heart is much stronger now and I feel like a new person. I'm so glad, Alexander replied sincerely. How is Tommy? I sent him a letter, but I wasn't sure if he received it. He did receive it, Your Highness, and he's very excited to meet you someday. He keeps the letter on his bedside table and reads it every night before bed, Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. Alexander beamed with pleasure. He had worried that his letter might seem silly to another child, but knowing that Tommy appreciated it made him feel warm inside. Maybe he could visit the palace sometime? I'd love to meet him. Morrison looked surprised and honored by the invitation. That would be wonderful, Your Highness. Tommy would be thrilled. As they talked, other guards passed by and greeted both the prince and Morrison with obvious warmth and respect. The atmosphere among the palace staff had noticeably improved since the implementation of the new welfare policies, and Morrison had become something of a hero for being the catalyst for such positive changes. Captain Morrison, Alexander said thoughtfully, have the new rules helped the other guards? Morrison nodded enthusiastically. Oh yes, Your Highness. Just last week, Guard Thompson was able to get help for his injured shoulder before it became serious, and Guard Martinez felt comfortable reporting his concerns about his diabetes medication. The new welfare officer, Mrs. Bennett, has made such a difference. Alexander was pleased to hear that the changes were working well. Mrs. Bennett, a former nurse with extensive experience in employee health programs, had proven to be an excellent choice for the new position. She had quickly gained the trust of the palace staff and had already prevented several minor health issues from becoming major problems. The best part, Morrison continued, is that we all feel like we're part of a team now, instead of just individual guards trying to prove how tough we are. When someone needs help, everyone pitches in. This news filled Alexander with satisfaction. The young prince was learning that good leadership often created positive effects that spread far beyond the original problem being solved. As they walked toward the main palace, Morrison shared more details about how the policy changes had affected daily life for the guards. The culture of rigid hierarchy and silent suffering had been replaced by one of mutual support and open communication about health and safety concerns. Your Highness, Morrison said as they reached the palace steps, I want you to know that what you did for me wasn't just about saving my job or my health. You showed all of us that our welfare matters to the royal family. That means more to us than you might realize. Alexander considered Morrison's words carefully. He was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't just about solving individual problems, but about creating an environment where people felt valued and cared for. This was a lesson that would serve him well throughout his life. That afternoon, Alexander attended his first official palace meeting, invited by his father to observe how policy decisions were made and implemented. King William wanted his son to see the administrative side of the changes that had resulted from his compassionate actions. Prince Alexander, General Patterson said as the meeting began, I want to thank you again for identifying the problems in our guard welfare system. The changes we've implemented have not only improved morale, but have actually enhanced our security effectiveness. Alexander listened carefully as the general explained how happier guards were more alert and reliable than those who struggled with untreated health problems or fears about job security. Mrs. Bennett, the new welfare officer, presented her first quarterly report, showing a significant decrease in serious health incidents among palace staff and an increase in early reporting of minor issues that could be quickly resolved. Your Highness, Mrs. Bennett said, addressing Alexander directly, your intervention with Captain Morrison taught us that sometimes the most important leadership comes from simply paying attention to people around us and caring enough to help when they need it. Alexander felt proud but also somewhat overwhelmed by the responsibility that seemed to come with being royal. He was learning that his actions and decisions could affect many people's lives, which was both exciting and a little frightening for an 8-year-old. After the meeting, King William walked with his son through the palace corridors, using the opportunity to discuss what they had heard and what it meant for Alexander's future role in the monarchy. Father, Alexander said as they walked, I never expected that helping Captain Morrison would change so many things for so many people. That's often how real leadership works, my son, King William replied. One act of compassion can inspire changes that improve life for many people, but it only works if the leader is willing to follow through on the implications of their actions. What do you mean? Alexander asked. Well, you could have simply helped Captain Morrison and then forgotten about it, but instead, you thought about why the problem existed and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. That's the difference between a kind gesture and true leadership. Alexander nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he had been as thoughtful as his father suggested. Much of what had happened seemed to flow naturally from his concern for Morrison, rather than from any deliberate plan. The important thing, King William continued, is that you're learning to see connections between individual problems and larger systems. That skill will serve you well as you grow up and take on more responsibilities. As evening approached, Alexander found himself back in the gardens where the day's adventure had begun 3 weeks earlier. He could see the guards at their posts, but now he noticed small changes in how they interacted with each other. More conversation, more obvious concern for each other's welfare, and a general sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. The young prince realized that his morning encounter with Captain Morrison had taught him more about leadership than any book or formal lesson ever could. He had learned that true authority came not from rank or title, but from the willingness to use whatever power you had to help others and improve the world around you. 6 months after the incident with Captain Morrison, Prince Alexander had become something of a legend among the palace staff. Stories of the 8-year-old prince who ordered a guard to sit down and then changed palace policy had spread beyond the royal residence, inspiring similar reforms in other government buildings and military installations throughout the kingdom. Alexander, however, remained largely unaware of his growing reputation. To him, what had happened with Captain Morrison was simply the right thing to do, and he was pleased that it had led to positive changes for the people who worked so hard to serve his family. On this particular morning, Alexander was once again in the gardens with Mr. Harrison for their outdoor lesson. As they walked past the spot where Captain Morrison had struggled 6 months earlier, both the prince and his tutor reflected on how much had changed since that day. "Mr. Harrison," Alexander said thoughtfully, "do you think I'll face more situations like the one with Captain Morrison when I'm older?" The old tutor smiled at his young charge's question. "Your Highness, leadership is largely about recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to act on that recognition. As you grow older and your responsibilities increase, you'll encounter many such situations." Alexander nodded, considering this prospect with the seriousness of someone much older than his 8 years. "I hope I'll know what to do when those times come." "Based on what I've observed," Mr. Harrison replied, "you seem to have excellent instincts for leadership. The key is to continue developing your compassion and your willingness to challenge systems that don't serve people well." As they settled on their usual bench for the day's lesson, Alexander noticed Tommy Morrison playing with other children near the fountain. Captain Morrison's son had become a regular visitor to the palace, and Alexander had developed a genuine friendship with the boy who shared his love of books and curiosity about the world. "Tommy," Alexander called out, waving to his friend. The boy ran over with a huge smile, his face flushed from playing tag with the other children. "Prince Alexander, guess what? My father says the doctor told him his heart is completely healthy now, and he might even be promoted to senior captain next month." Alexander felt a warm glow of satisfaction at this news. Captain Morrison's full recovery was the best possible outcome from that frightening morning 6 months ago, and the prospect of his promotion showed that his illness hadn't harmed his career prospects. "That's wonderful news, Tommy. Your father deserves the promotion. He's one of the best guards in the palace," Alexander said sincerely. As the boys chatted about Tommy's father's recovery and potential promotion, Mr. Harrison observed how naturally Alexander interacted with children from different backgrounds. The prince showed no signs of the arrogance or entitlement that sometimes affected royal children, instead displaying genuine interest in others and concern for their welfare. After Tommy returned to his games, Mr. Harrison resumed the day's lesson, which focused on the history of social reforms in the kingdom. The irony of studying historical examples of leadership while sitting in the spot where Alexander had demonstrated such leadership was not lost on either of them. "Your Highness," Mr. Harrison said as he opened their history book, "today we're going to study King Marcus the Reformer, who ruled our kingdom 200 years ago. He was known for implementing policies that improved the lives of common people." Alexander listened attentively as Mr. Harrison described King Marcus's various reforms, including improved working conditions for palace staff, better health care for soldiers, and new laws protecting workers from exploitation. The parallels to his own recent experiences were striking. "King Marcus sounds like he was a good king," Alexander observed. "But why did it take a king to make those changes? Couldn't someone else have implemented those reforms?" Mr. Harrison considered the question carefully. "An excellent observation, Your Highness. The truth is that many people probably recognize the need for those reforms, but only someone with sufficient authority could actually implement them. That's one of the responsibilities that comes with royal power. So being royal means using your authority to help people, not just to get what you want, Alexander asked. Exactly. The most respected monarchs in history are remembered not for their wealth or comfort, but for how they used their power to improve life for their subjects. As their lesson continued, Alexander found himself thinking about the future and the kind of king he wanted to become. The experience with Captain Morrison had shown him that even as a young prince he could make a difference in people's lives. As he grew older and gained more authority, his ability to help others would increase correspondingly. That afternoon, Alexander attended another policy meeting with his father, where Mrs. Bennet presented her latest report on the palace welfare program. The results continued to be impressive. Workplace injuries were down, employee satisfaction was up, and the overall efficiency of palace operations had improved significantly. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Bennet said, addressing King William, "I've been contacted by administrators from other royal households throughout Europe who are interested in implementing similar welfare programs. Prince Alexander's initiative has attracted international attention." Alexander felt a mixture of pride and embarrassment at this news. He had never intended for his actions to become a model for other countries, but he was pleased that more people might benefit from improved workplace policies. After the meeting, King William took his son aside for a private conversation about the growing attention his actions had attracted. "Alexander," King William said gently, "your intervention with Captain Morrison has become an example of compassionate leadership that people are studying and copying." "How do you feel about that?" Alexander thought carefully before responding. "I'm glad if it helps other people, Father, but I hope they understand that I didn't do anything special. I just saw someone who needed help and tried to help them." King William smiled at his son's humility. "The fact that you see it as something ordinary rather than extraordinary is precisely what makes it special, Alexander. True leaders don't help others for recognition or praise. They help because they can't imagine doing anything else." As evening fell, Alexander stood at his bedroom window looking out over the palace grounds. He could see Captain Morrison at his post, healthy and strong, chatting easily with other guards who no longer felt compelled to suffer in silence when they faced health problems or personal difficulties. The young prince realized that the most important lesson from his experience wasn't about giving orders or using royal authority. It was about paying attention to the people around him and caring enough to act when he saw someone in need. As he grew older and faced greater challenges, this fundamental principle would guide his approach to leadership. Looking back on that morning 6 months ago, Alexander understood that his decision to order Captain Morrison to sit down had been about much more than helping one sick guard. It had been his first real lesson in using power responsibly, and it had set the foundation for the kind of leader he wanted to become. The 8-year-old prince went to sleep that night knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to learn, to help others, and to continue developing the compassionate leadership that would serve him well throughout his life as a member of the royal family.